I'd like to introduce Professor Conor Gearty, who's a very distinguished barrister, founding member of Matrix Chambers, and also Professor of Human Rights Law at LSE. And he's talking this evening on the topic of human rights after Gaza. But I'd like to pitch my first question at you, a rather personal kind, is what exactly brought you into working on human rights? I mean, was that what you studied at UC and did your doctorate on? Or?
No.
It wasn't?
No, completely the opposite.
Really?
Some of my students say, how can I become Professor of Human Rights Law and a barrister specialising in human rights? My answer, not entirely whimsical, is first you must oppose human rights. You must take a very dim view of it and you must hate all lawyers. Because my early career, I'm Irish.
Yes.
I was in Britain during the high points of the IRA battles.
Yes.
I developed, influenced by the Birmingham Six and so on,
Yes.
a very strong animosity towards the judges. And I also was an old socialist. So I thought this human rights thing is a bourgeois trick. So that if we want to nationalise and if we want to confiscate and if we want to affect power, we're going to find my learned friends and their barristers responding by curbing us through the language of human rights. So I was against both.
Yes.
And over time, I will acknowledge I've changed my mind. I think that law is now far more important than I thought it was, far more important. The legal system in Britain is far more independent than it was, in my opinion. The people involved are much more committed to law than power and class.
And you think if we had a kind of replay of what was almost a civil war, well, it was a civil war in Northern Ireland, the judiciary would have looked rather different from what in fact happened?
I do. I think it's fair to say, and I need to say it, that the Northern Ireland judiciary were amazing. Now, not every case, you know, but they were in the firing line. There were a number of Catholics on the judicial bench in Northern Ireland who were at personal risk. The Northern Ireland judges did their very best in an impossible situation. It was the more senior figures in the safety of the House of Lords, as the senior court then was positioned, who were the ones who provided sort of cover. You know, the Lord Diplocks, the Lord Dennings, the Lord Bridges and so on. So I had no problem with them. It's hard to know now if there were similar levels of challenge to the state. My impression is that the judges of today are committed to law in a way that perhaps wasn't the case with the ex-servicemen, the people who'd served in the 50s as people who'd done national service and had a different attitude, I think.
Cardinal Hume did very well on that, didn't he?
He did. He chose his battles with great care.
He did.
He had to be persuaded, and then once he embraced it, in his case, I think it was mainly the Guildford and Maguire cases, he was absolutely unrelenting in his support.
Yes.
Yeah. And then human rights, you see, it, I think, has become not just a liberal device. Human rights has become a way of articulating a commitment to the marginalised and the powerless, which it wasn't, I think.
Certainly that during the decolonisation period, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
It was taken,
And it certainly, I think, now represents a term that captures the plight of people who are being unnoticed.
This is sort of sheer ignorance, but I think most of us have got a kind of 1948 United Nations Declaration understanding of human rights as things that we have an entitlement to and we have a right to, and things we have a right not to have happening to us, the two sort of sides of this. But the moment you get into a war situation, as of course you had in Northern Ireland, everything, the caveats seem to come in. We move into a different domain, which is all about the sort of Geneva Convention and things like that. I mean, is that in fact, I mean, what's your feeling about that? How well can human rights expect to do in a war situation?
There's been really interesting recent developments.
Really?
Very. And they're culminating in, as it were, the unfolding drama of Israel before various international courts. These are the developments. The war thing got going in the 19th century. So there was a thing started called international humanitarian law. So you find your enemy on the battlefield, you don't just kill him for kicks. Or you have a prisoner, you don't just starve them. So there's a whole code which predates the United Nations, predates the Charter,
Yes.
predates
Yes.
the UN Declaration. So it's there before it. But what has been happening has been that the idea of human rights has been kind of swarming around the old laws of war and has been, as it were, infecting it with a human rights attitude. Nowhere is this clearer than in the development of the idea that you punish war makers for breaches not of international humanitarian law, the old words, but for breaches of crimes against humanity, for genocide, or, very particularly in the context of war, war crimes. So we have got now a pretty solid enforcement mechanism for very, very bad behaviour in war. We don't have that if you want to feed starving people in North Korea.
Sure.
We don't have mechanisms outside of war to force states to act.
Hence the preservation and punishment of the punishment of preservation of human rights and the punishment as the words of the 1948.
That's right.
And this was
that's right. There's always been this.
Yeah.
There's always been this tension in human rights. Is human rights about giving people things they have a right to, or punishing people for taking them away?
Yes.
And the bit that has the current upper hand is punishing people for taking them away.
And that comes in 1998 with the International Criminal Court.
Yeah. First of all,
which of course the Americans never wanted.
Never belonged to. Wanted to influence, but not belong to.
Sure.
But it itself was built on punishing the bad guys in Rwanda, punishing the bad guys in Yugoslavia, and of course punishing the Japanese and punishing the Germans. So there was a post-war record of punishing bad people for what were called crimes against humanity. But the International Criminal Court was the result of a generalization of this. So it's not just special to Rwanda, special to this, special to that. It becomes something which is available to all the countries that sign up to it.
Sure. Now, perhaps you can help me on the distinction between the International Court of Justice and the ICC, both in The Hague. Is it the case that the International Court of Justice is essentially for litigation between states, and the other is individuals who have alleged war crimes against them? Is that the sort of the gist of it? Or
That's the gist.
Is it more? There's more to it than that, obviously.
That's the gist of it.
Yeah.
Essentially, the International Court of Justice is something that's been around for ages,
Yes.
and the thing before it.
From the League of Nations.
From the League of Nations, and even then there was of all things, the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague. So there's always been a bunch of people who are called judges or arbitrators who adjudicate on disputes, and the disputes are between states.
Sure.
So there might be a crossword between countries A and B about territorial waters over to the ICC.
Yes.
There might be this, there might be that. And every now and again, its jurisdiction gets added to. So if you look at the Genocide Convention, the Genocide Convention provides a mechanism to refer matters of dispute to the International Court of Justice. 1948, the International Courts just got going. If there is something, says the Genocide Agreement, concerning uncertainty about the meaning of this, or then it goes to the ICJ. No human being goes to the ICJ. A country is put before the ICJ.
Yes.
So South Africa famously, in the recent past, has applied to the ICJ, International Court of Justice, alleging genocide on the part of Israel over the Palestinians.
Is that unprecedented? I mean, is that the
There
first?
are lots. No, there's genocide cases. There's lots of them. Now, this is where it's fascinating. The global north is familiar with the application of these rules against people for whom it has no sympathy. And so in such circumstances, they applaud the expansive interpretations hither and thither of the International Court of Justice. And there is law about genocide. The Rohingya have been caught up in it in what used to be called Burma, Myanmar. There's stuff, and we remember that. But now, armed with the jurisprudence and the reference from South Africa, the court deploys the jurisprudence of the past against a country that, in a way, it was not anticipated would find itself in the receiving end of this when it was thought up in 1948. So Mr. Netanyahu is certainly right to condemn it as unprecedented.
Yeah.
What he means is this genocide convention is for other people, you know, for goodness sake, international law, put yourself together. And there's a really nice trap here, summed up by the Americans when they secured the appointment of Joan Donoghue, the president of the International Court of Justice. Mr. Biden was very proud of the contribution America makes to international law and how delighted he is that there's an American president. But then you can't simply ignore it when it does things that are inconvenient to you. Yeah. So that's the...
And Joan Donoghue was the president of the ICJ until quite recently, wasn't it? Just retired very recently.
Then I think that she certainly provided over the key...
She did the first application.
Now, you asked a question, though, about the difference between the two. And the crucial difference that you picked up is that the International Criminal Court is about individual bad people. That's a very big decision that was taken. The International Court of Justice is about wrongdoing states. And the wrongdoing might be about the sea, as I said, or it might be about this or that, or territorial disputes, or it might be about really bad things, like genocide. Whereas the International Criminal Court, the secret is in the name, is about criminal conduct. Yes. So it's conduct of people.
Sure.
So, and who? There is very subtle provisions to try and get the organising bad guys.
Yeah.
The International Criminal Court's not particularly interested, although perhaps arguably it should be, in the military officer at the lower rank rapes and kills because he's been working or she in a position of impunity. They're interested in who gave him the orders or her the orders. They're interested in working up the chain. And they are working up the chain to find the bad guys, and they don't care if they're president or if they're prime minister or if they're the chief of staff, and they are looking for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide.
Sure.
And this is why the Israelis are, I think, genuinely concerned. They're not in the ICC. You have to join it. They are in the United Nations. They are in the Genocide Convention. So South Africa could take the case against Israel because they both belong. They're not in the international criminal system. Of course they're not. Israel wouldn't join it. But Palestine, guess what, did. And Palestine went along and said, sorry, we're a state. We've just...
And so did we. I remember very clearly Bill Clinton leaning on Tony Blair to try and make him follow the American line and walk away.
So the real challenging moment for Israel happened before the 7th of October. This is what happened.
Sure.
The chief prosecutor, not the current person, his predecessor, she thought the following. We've now accepted Palestine are a state. Controversial, but they did, for the purposes of the ICC.
Sure.
This is a state which has bad people doing bad things in it, or at least we think it might. Does the fact that those bad people, arguably, doing bad things, arguably, are from a country that does not belong to this treaty mean we can't investigate them? No, it doesn't. We can investigate them. Right. We can't investigate what they're doing in Israel, the home country, because they've not joined. But if they run into another country which has joined, we jolly well can. So she said, I better be sure. This is where we really have this. She asks the court to rule. And the court ruled by only 2-1 in a jurisdictional matter that Israel was responsible under the International Criminal Court's remit for conduct it engages in member state territories.
As an occupying force.
As an occupying force.
That's the key. You've got to have the acceptance of the occupation.
That's right. Well, you certainly have to have them in an organised way marauding in your state.
Sure. And this is where you get the interdiction on the supply of food and water, electricity, things like, all of which would come under the heading of conduct that is absolutely unacceptable in terms of occupying force.
Yes. So, for example, to push it through, if Israel decided to lay waste to a part of what is recognised as Israel today, and starve endless Palestinians into death, that would be a shocking business. But it wouldn't be within the remit of the International Criminal Court.
Sure.
It if they go into if the de facto accepted by everybody really occupied territories and do the same, they are vulnerable. Yeah. And that's where they're in trouble, because it's very hard to see if Mr. Putin can be indicted, which he has been, by the International Criminal Court. It's very hard to see how you could plausibly exempt Mr. Netanyahu and his team, because they have very publicly explained what they're doing. They have very publicly defended what they're doing, which looks sensible to them, but to the lawyers looks like what is defined as a war crime. So they're in trouble.
What strikes you is that it's very difficult to see a sort of linear progress in the recognition and preservation of human rights when you have a situation which superficially looks like, for a medieval castle, take Gaza. Here is a besieging type of situation. It's been besieged for quite some time. It's not, but it's just got more besieged in a war context. And it strikes me that, having had a quick look at the ICJ verdict, perhaps not quite the right word, at least their ruling. It is the issue of famine is very, very central, and the behaviour that has created famine is quite important in their thinking.
Yes.
And also the military's role in interdicting trucks and doing stuff like that. Yeah.
Yes.
This seems to be a big part of their sense that it's not wrong to talk about sort of protecting people from genocide.
No, that's correct. And you see the different remits. The South Africans took a case, the only case they could do, to get Israel before an international tribunal, which had to be genocide. Genocide's a massive escalation. It's incredibly unusual to be able to allege a genocidal intent.
Yes.
If you want to go about doing it, one thing you would do is you would starve the people to death. And you would also sometimes boast about it. So the data is there. It's very unusual. It's a sign, I'm afraid, editorial point coming up, how demented the Israeli leadership seems to have been, that they haven't even done what previous leadership would definitely have done, created the impression of rigorous adherence to the rule of law. They'd have had Israeli support. Instead, it looks like a wild effort to starve them. The ICC's remit is much milder, much milder. So the ICC is asking far easier to meet questions of standard, war crimes, crimes against humanity-ish, genocide. I think myself, the International Court of Justice has made warrants inevitable. Because how can the ICC, the International Criminal Court, sit about saying, oh, we haven't got any interest in issuing a warrant against anybody in Israel, when the ICJ, the more conservative body, has made these extraordinary statements, albeit temporary and so on, or interlocutory or provisional, they're not findings about the possibility of a genocidal intent.
No.
How can the ICC just sit and ignore that?
What strikes me is that they have been quite cautious in the ICJ not to actually sort of say that there is a genocide going on, it's not a genocide, and that their whole approach has been to be giving orders and demanding measures to prevent going down any road that leads towards that. And that is really quite a sophisticated position.
It is, but if you think about it, to take a topical example, which is very easy to grasp within this country, you are about to send somebody to a third country and they'll be killed or tortured. Yes. I don't need to mention Rwanda, where it's more, but that sort of thing.
Sure.
The European Court of Human Rights can and does issue what are called interim orders.
Yes.
And the interim orders are to preserve the status quo so that when you come to analyse things, it's still worth doing. Now map that onto the ICJ. You go to the International Court of Justice and you say Israel are committing a genocide. Well, we'll decide it in 8 years. Well, if you decide it in 8 years, it'll be a bit late in the day, won't it? So, because these things take ages, and international proceedings take ages. 8 years is an exaggeration, but not a huge exaggeration.
Sure.
So what you say, it often happens in law, you say, pending the resolution of this issue, can we please have in Europe it's called an interim measure. In British law it's called an interlocutory injunction. Can we maintain the status quo? Which in this case would be, can we have an order which stops the propensity, the genocidal move? You don't have to say it's genocide. You have to say that will prevent what might afterwards be seen as genocide. So you get an order like that. Now, the International Court of Justice didn't order Israel to stop. No. I'm not a specialist in the field, but it struck me that they couldn't really do that, and I don't think South Africa especially wanted it. But they did order what you might call a maintenance of some kind of living Palestinian community pending the resolution of the issue of genocide.
And actions which would mitigate the,
correct.
The deterioration.
Correct, correct. And which would stop the propensity, the plausible propensity for genocide. And how did the Israelis react? On the very day of the International Court of Justice proceedings, they announced that UNRWA, which is the relief organization, was infested with Hamas, and they procured all their friends in the north to cut off all aid. And so the reaction to the judgment was to increase the levels of starvation. And then they killed lots of the people who were receiving aid. And honestly, what was that about? And the Israelis might then say, we'd rather like to have that situation. So we'd rather like Hamas to be out in the open, wearing a little hat which says Hamas, running at us. And we all know what would happen. Same with Hezbollah. They'd be obliterated in about a day.
Yes.
So Hamas have not decided to play by international rules and die.
Sure.
So they are doing what all sensible rebels would do, which is they are hiding. It's terribly annoying for military power to hide. Yeah. And the Israelis would then say they're hiding. And they're hiding in the deeply populated civilian Gaza, and they are sensibly hiding where international law says you shouldn't hit. And we have to get them.
And you drop £20,000 bombs to get them. And also you work out, because your computers and your artificial intelligence is telling you that the Hamas bloke is in the house with his family, so then they bomb the entire family and so on. That makes a kind of wild kind of sense. Yes.
And that also makes sense of, for example, obliterating southern Gaza.
Sure. Because
all those pesky Hamas people are hiding in their pesky tunnels, and they've got 1 million people between them and the air. So let's kill the 1 million people, and we'll get them. And of course, I only have to say it like that to realise there is actually a legal test, which is very handy, which is called proportionality, and it pops up all the time. Sure. And so we can agree, although I don't have to, but I can agree for the purposes of this discussion, to say that the Israelis have a legitimate aim, which is the extermination of Hamas. Not sure I believe it, but there you are. They have that legitimate aim. But what they're doing is madly disproportionate. Sure. So you don't destroy an entire people because you want to get at the Hamas commanders.
But what they've been doing apparently is putting putting a figure on collateral damage, that so much collateral damage is acceptable, after that it isn't, which, I mean, I don't know how that looks in legal terms.
No, I don't know either. I suppose it all depends what the Americans allow them to do.
Sure.
You know, they think they get away completely and act with impunity with American perpetual support. That's being tested at the moment.
Yeah. Do you think the ICJ measures that have been asked and the orders that have been made in the 2 applications by South Africa have significantly had some impact in terms of mitigating the circumstances? And I mean, because most people think it's just Biden beginning to threaten more seriously.
Yeah, I just don't know.
It's very hard to know.
We'd need one of those marvellous BBC programmes in about 2 years.
Yes.
What it could be is rational elements, if there are any left, around Netanyahu saying, for God's sake, would you not put one settler in jail, please, or sack somebody?
Yes.
And then also the Biden phone calls. I think with Biden's support, they couldn't give a damn.
Sure.
About the International Court of Justice.
Right.
The International Criminal Court's more dangerous for them because Mr. Nehu would like to be able to meet his friends.
Sure.
And it does affect their travel and all the various desires to connect with the rest of the world. But I doubt they're sitting around waiting for an email attachment with the court order to work out exactly what they can do. And you wouldn't begin ratchet up starvation the day after the judgment if you were paying attention to it.
Very interesting, because I mean, what you're really saying is that the ICJ deliberations and orders, measures are having knock-on effects into the capacity of the International Criminal Court to select individuals, and that is beginning to hurt.
That'll hurt. And also the presentation of power of the ICJ, whether they win or lose, to see those lawyers reigned in front of those international judges who looked wonderful.
Yes.
All colour, all gender, all nationalities, all languages, and then to see with respect to them, the bumbling effort that the Israelis made to defend themselves. That has a power independently of the outcome.
Professor Gearty, thank you very much. It's been fascinating.
Thank you very much.